I mean, he didn't throw things away. I mean, I'm that old. That often comes from your own family background.
They tried to keep this quiet. But the truth is out. King Charles has just handed Princess Anne something so powerful, so unexpected that the entire British establishment is in shock. And Queen Camilla? She has been left completely in the cold. This is not a rumor. This is not speculation.
I think I eventually learnt that in horse trials and event riding, you should be sort of 85 to 90% in control of what goes on.
The monarchy just changed forever, and almost nobody is talking about what it actually means. Once you understand what Princess Anne now holds in her hands, you will never look at the royal family the same way again. To understand what is happening now, you have to go back to late 2022, when Queen Elizabeth was approaching the final weeks of her life. She was 96 years old, she had been on the throne for 70 years, and she understood the institution she was leaving behind better than anyone alive. She also understood its vulnerabilities, and one of those vulnerabilities was a practical legal problem that nobody in the press was discussing openly at the time. Under the Regency Acts, a fixed group of royals are designated as counselors of state. These are the people who can legally step in for the monarch when the king or queen is either unwell or out of the country. They can sign legislation. They can hold audiences. They can carry out the formal business of the crown when the sovereign cannot be present. It sounds like a sensible system, and for most of the 20th century it worked reasonably well. But by late 2022, the list had a serious problem. The people legally eligible to serve as counselors of state included Prince Harry, who had moved to California and stepped back from royal life entirely. They included Prince Andrew, who had become politically untouchable following his association with Jeffrey Epstein, and the civil lawsuit that followed. And they included Princess Beatrice, who had never been a working member of the royal family and was not in a position to take on those responsibilities. Queen Camilla was on the list as the monarch's spouse. Prince William was on it as heir to the throne. But beyond them, the practical reality was that the safety net had holes in it. Elizabeth recognized this before she died. Through a formal request to Parliament, King Charles, acting on what was clearly a plan developed with his mother, asked for the Regency Acts to be amended. The request was read to the House of Lords, and within weeks, Parliament passed the Councillors of State Act 2022. Princess Anne and Prince Edward, the Duke of Edinburgh, were added to the list of Councillors of State permanently, meaning for the rest of their lives, unlike Harry, Andrew, and Beatrice, whose positions would gradually be replaced as younger royals came of age. It was presented as a technical legal adjustment. In reality, it was something much more deliberate. It quietly sidelined 3 royals who were either unavailable or unsuitable, and it put 2 trusted, experienced working members of the family into a position of genuine constitutional authority. And it did so in a way that was clean, legal, and impossible to challenge. Nobody could argue with an act of Parliament. The question worth asking is why Anne specifically? She is the king's only sister. She is 2 years younger than Charles. She has been a working royal since she was 18 years old. But the answer goes deeper than family loyalty or seniority. Princess Anne has spent more than 5 decades building a record of public service that is, by almost any measure, unmatched within the royal family. For several consecutive years running up to 2025, she was recorded as carrying out more official engagements than any other working royal. In 2024, that number was 457. In 2025, she performed 478, a 10% increase even as she turned 75. She traveled to 14 countries on behalf of the crown. She represented King Charles as the reviewing officer at the Sovereign's Parade at the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst in December 2025. She hosted investiture ceremonies, led charity forums, and carried out diplomatic visits across the United Kingdom and abroad, all without seeking personal attention for any of it. King Charles himself performed 532 engagements in 2025, which was a remarkable figure for a man undergoing cancer treatment, and it meant that for the first time in several years, Anne was not the single busiest working royal. But the public response to that news was telling. Rather than viewing her second place ranking as a setback, people on social media called her a trooper, a national treasure, someone who works unbelievably hard and never shouts about it. The affection was genuine and it ran deep. And it was not built on celebrity or on drama. It was built on consistency. That consistency has a long history behind it. Queen Elizabeth spent decades sending Anne to the most demanding parts of the Commonwealth, not for the pleasant ceremonial tours that other royals received, but for the visits where things were genuinely tense, where relationships needed careful handling, and where a mistake could cause real diplomatic damage. Elizabeth gave her daughter real authority to speak and act on behalf of the crown when she could not be there in person. That was not a small thing. That was a prolonged, practical education in high-level statecraft that Anne received across some of the most difficult decades of the 20th century. By the time Charles became king in September 2022, his sister was not simply a loyal member of the family. She was the most experienced diplomatic operator in the entire institution, someone who had been tested repeatedly in genuinely difficult circumstances and had never once let the crown down. There is another quality that makes Anne particularly suited to the role she now occupies, and it is one that is easy to overlook but matters enormously in the context of royal politics. She has no personal ambition for power. She cannot become queen. She was pushed down the line of succession decades ago by old male preference rules that prioritized her younger brothers over her simply because of their gender, and she accepted that without complaint and got on with the work. By the time those rules were reformed with the Succession to the Crown Act 2013, it made no practical difference to her position. She was already far down the line. What that means in practice is that when Anne exercises authority on behalf of the king, nobody can credibly suggest she is doing it for personal gain. There is no faction behind her, no rival group using her as a vehicle to accumulate influence. When she carries out the formal duties of a counselor of state, or represents the king at a significant ceremony, or leads 6,000 armed services personnel through the streets of London on horseback, as she did during Charles's coronation in May 2023 in her role as gold-stick-in-waiting, the public and the government understand that she is doing it because she was asked to and because she believes it is the right thing to do. That kind of trust is not easy to find, and Charles knows it. The coronation itself was one of the clearest signals Charles has sent about where he places Anne within his reign. The role of gold-stick-in-waiting dates back to the 15th century. It was historically given to the person the monarch trusted most with their personal safety. Choosing Anne for that role in front of a global television audience of hundreds of millions was not an accident. It was a deliberate public statement of confidence in her. It told everyone watching exactly how Charles thinks about his sister and the place she occupies in his reign. That confidence has only deepened since then, as Charles has managed his cancer treatment alongside a schedule of more than 500 official engagements. The institution has adapted around his circumstances in ways that are practical and quietly impressive. William is growing into his future role, taking on more responsibilities and showing clear signs of the king he will eventually become. But William is also a husband whose wife has been through serious illness and a father to 3 young children. There are limits to how much he can absorb right now, and Charles understands that. Anne has no such constraints. She turns up, she does the work, and she does it without asking for recognition or credit in return. There is a moment that many people who watched the BBC documentary about Charles's coronation year say stayed with them long after the film ended. Princess Anne, sitting in front of a camera and speaking with the kind of directness she has always been known for, described being present during the final days of Queen Elizabeth's life at Balmoral. She talked about how her mother had been worried about dying there, not for her own sake, but because of the logistical complications it would create for the government and for the family. And Anne had told her simply and firmly to stop thinking about that and to spend her final days wherever she wanted to be because she had earned that peace. Then Anne described watching the imperial state crown being lifted from her mother's coffin during the funeral at Westminster Abbey. And she said something that caught a lot of people off guard. She described feeling a sense of relief. Not because she did not love her mother, and not because she was not grieving, but because she understood what that crown had meant in terms of weight and sacrifice. And she recognized that the burden her mother had carried for 70 years had finally been set down. There was something almost gentle in the way she talked about it. Something honest and unperformed. That moment landed differently with the British public than almost anything else that came out of the royal family during that entire period. In an institution that has historically protected itself through formality and distance, Anne had simply told the truth about what it cost to dedicate a life to service. And people responded to it with enormous warmth because it felt real in a way that official royal communications rarely do. It also illuminated something that had been building for years in terms of how the public thinks about Anne and her place within the family. She is not someone who performs the role of a royal. She is someone who does the work of one. And the distinction matters more than it might seem on the surface. Consider what the engagement numbers actually represent. In 2025, Princess Anne carried out 478 official engagements. To put that into some kind of human context, that is nearly 1.5 official appearances every single day of the year, including weekends. Each of those engagements involves travel, preparation, speeches, meetings with people who have often waited a long time for that visit to happen. Behind each number in that tally is a hospital ward, a school, a regiment, a charity, a farming conference, an investiture ceremony where someone receives an honor they have spent years working toward. Anne showed up for all of it, and she did so while also increasing her workload by 10% compared to the year before. What makes that even more striking is the context in which it happened. The royal family as a whole performed significantly more engagements in 2025 than in 2024, partly because both Charles and Catherine had been dealing with their respective health situations the year before and were now returning to fuller schedules. The institution was essentially catching up with itself, and yet Anne, who had never stepped back in the first place, simply raised her own output alongside everyone else. This is the foundation on which her current position within the monarchy rests. It is not a title, though she holds significant ones. It is not close to the king through marriage, though her relationship with Charles is genuinely close. It is the accumulated weight of decades of showing up, consistently and without drama, in places where the work of the crown actually needs to be done. Now consider the contrast that creates with Queen Camilla's position, and this is where the situation becomes genuinely interesting to observe. Camilla holds the title of Queen Consort. She is married to the king. She is present at state occasions and carries out a meaningful schedule of public duties. 228 official engagements in 2025. By any conventional measure, she occupies one of the most prominent positions in the country, and yet when it comes to the actual legal authority to exercise the monarch's powers, to step in formally on the king's behalf, and carry out the constitutional business of the crown, that authority belongs to the counselors of state. It belongs to William, and it belongs to Anne. This is not a personal slight against Camilla. The counselors of state system is a legal framework, not an expression of personal preference. But the practical reality is that when Charles needs someone to formally deputize for him, the person he calls upon is his sister. The person who rode directly behind his coronation coach through the streets of London, who inspects officer cadets at Sandhurst on his behalf, who hosts investiture ceremonies at Windsor Castle while he manages his treatment schedule, is Anne. Camilla attends the events. Anne runs them. There is also a longer history underneath all of this that gives the current dynamic an additional layer of complexity. The British public never fully reconciled with Camilla's role in the breakdown of Charles and Diana's marriage. Decades have passed. Diana has been gone since 1997, and Camilla has worked consistently to fulfill her duties as queen consort. But that shadow has never entirely lifted, and it shapes the way people interpret moments of contrast between the two women. Perhaps more than is entirely fair to either of them. What the public has decided, looking at the situation as it stands, is that Anne represents something they recognize and trust. She does not seek the spotlight. She does not appear to need validation from the press or from public opinion. She turns 75, increases her workload, and issues a rare public statement not about herself, but about the 1 million caregivers her charity supported during the previous year. The statement is characteristically direct. It acknowledges difficulty, honestly. It gives credit to the people doing the hard work rather than to the institution she represents. That is who she is, and people see it. Prince William and Catherine have both been clear in the signals they have sent about how they regard Anne, and those signals are worth paying attention to. William has spoken openly about viewing his aunt as someone whose integrity and work ethic function almost as a form of protection for the family, someone whose reputation is so unimpeachable that her presence around the institution raises its credibility overall. At major public events, both he and Catherine have deliberately allowed Anne space and recognition rather than competing with her for attention. That kind of conscious, deliberate respect from the next generation of the monarchy says something significant about the role she plays. It also reflects something practical. William is in a period of transition right now, taking on more responsibilities than he had the year before, with Catherine gradually resuming her public role following her cancer treatment and remission. In 2025, William carried out 202 engagements, and Catherine 68, both figures substantially higher than 2024, when Catherine had managed only 13 engagements during her treatment. The direction of travel is clear and it is positive, but the Prince and Princess of Wales are still finding their footing in this expanded version of their public role. Having Anne carrying significant institutional weight in the meantime is not just convenient. It is genuinely useful to everyone, including William. The broader picture that emerges when you take all of this in together is of a monarchy that is somewhat against the odds, managing a genuinely difficult period with more clarity and less internal chaos than many people expected. Charles is dealing with his health while performing a remarkable volume of public duties. Catherine is recovering and returning to prominence. William is stepping forward, and Anne is doing what she has always done, holding the center, keeping things running, showing up when it matters. What has shifted is that the public has finally started to see it plainly. The elevation of Anne to Counselor of State, the role she played at the coronation, the investments she conducts, the countries she visits on diplomatic missions, the charity work she sustains across more than 300 organizations. None of it is new. She has been doing all of it for decades. What is new is that the circumstances around her have changed in a way that makes her contribution impossible to overlook. When she hosted the first investiture ceremony of 2026 at Windsor Castle in January, presenting a Commander of the Order of the British Empire to broadcaster Martha Kearney, it was a moment that in ordinary times might have passed without much attention. But it did not pass without attention, because the context it exists within now is different. People understand what that ceremony represents, who is carrying it out, and why she is the one doing it. The monarchy has survived as long as it has because it has always found, in moments of genuine pressure, someone within the family who is willing to absorb the weight without complaining about it and without asking what they get in return. For this particular moment, in this particular reign, that person is Princess Anne. And the nation, watching quietly, has taken note.